Hello and welcome to another episode of the Philip Podcast. My name is Richard Haynes. I'm your host, and today I am super excited to have with me a good friend, Brent. So grateful to have Brent here today because he's a friend that I met a couple of years ago at a retreat, and he's almost like the embodiment of somebody who finds joy in life from so many things and from people. At least this is how I experience you. And of course, we could interview your kids and see if they feel the same way, and your wife. Probably, I'd guess they do. But Brent, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on today. I'm excited to be here and excited to, speaking of process, hear more about your process and with your show and all the things you like to unpack.
Oh yeah. Well, thank you, Brent. Tell us where you're from and where you grew up and stuff, and
Sure.
go ahead and get started with your story.
So I am here in Gig Harbor. I'm sitting in my car, which as you can tell from my surroundings, not a fancy office. It's my mobile office in Gig Harbor, Washington, which is, for those of you who might not be familiar with Washington, southwest of Seattle by about 32 miles as the crow flies. Bedroom community to Seattle, similar to a lot of, Northwest big cities, right? A lot of suburbs around it. So I'm the boring story. I was born and raised in a medium-sized town called Tacoma outside of the Puget Sound region. And met my wife up in Seattle at Seattle Pacific University, and she too was from Washington, but about 2 hours south, 2.5 hours south of Seattle from Longview. So we like to say we're the boring story, born and raised in Washington. We love to travel, but this will always be home. This is where we like coming home to. In fact, we just got back from a family wedding in Tennessee, North Carolina, or not Tennessee, North Carolina. We were really close to Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And my whole family, we had not seen that part of the world before and loved it, particularly this time of year in the fall. Leaves are changing color, but coming home was such just a welcome reprieve from just more humidity there than we have here. And so born and raised Washington and love to travel, but this is home and has always been home.
So how close to the Pacific Ocean do you live?
Good question. So if you were to drive to the ocean, we're probably about 2.5 hours or so.
Oh, okay.
Because we can't go due west. So you kind of go down and around. So it's a little circuitous. But we live right on the salt water. So it's one of the largest inland bodies of salt water in the U.S. It's a protected body called the Puget Sound. And so we love to boat, love to be on or near the water. That's our happy place.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny. It's more rare where you talk to somebody in Washington where they're spending time at the coast because it's kind of hard to get to, and it's not something people do as frequently, I guess.
So is the Puget Sound, did I say it right?
Yeah.
Is that connected with the ocean? Like there is some water that flows between it and the ocean?
Correct. Yeah. So our brethren to the north, our Canucks, the Canadians, right?
Yeah, those guys.
Yeah.
So
you go up the Puget Sound, it connects up to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is where the ocean meets Vancouver Island in British Columbia,
okay.
right? Okay. And all that area. And the whole area, pretty much the north end of Puget Sound and going into the Canadian San Juans, the Puget Sound, or the U.S. San Juan Islands, that whole area, it's called the Salish Sea. Yeah. So, which is a really fun place to explore, by the way.
Someday soon. Do you guys have marine life, like the same kind of ocean marine life that comes in close to where you are, like dolphins and whales and stuff like that? Or
we get some porpoises, not like a typical dolphin most people would think of when they think of like a warm water porpoise, but there's a lot of marine life. In fact, I think counterintuitively, the colder the water, or not actually the colder, but in colder water, you actually get a higher number of species. Don't quote me on this. I'm not a marine biologist, but I've been told in colder waters, you actually see more species of marine life than you do in the warmer bodies, like even varieties of fish and other things like that. And then the waters around, my friends in college, Richard would tell me, you were like the the deepest bucket of like worthless information, random facts, right? And
Hey,
so,
this isn't
so,
worthless to me right now. This is really
so
interesting. Yeah.
in our area, it was all created by huge, massive glaciers thousands of years ago, right?
Okay.
And as the glaciers receded, it stripped out really deep areas that were then filled in with water. And so, like the Puget Sound, so the inland body of water, there's parts of it that are over 800 feet deep. So it's really, really deep water, and even deeper than that in some areas. But to answer your question, yeah, so the marine life, there's a ton of it. And so there's actually a lot of scuba diving that takes place in the Puget Sound because there's so much marine life and activity. And then depending on the time of the year, there's more clarity in the water versus others.
And it's like an inland lake, right? So it doesn't have the tide that the ocean does.
I would kind of liken it to imagine like a Lake Erie.
Okay.
In inland body water, but instead of fresh water, salt water.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah. We lived a lot of boating.
We lived out in Ontario, actually right next to Lake Ontario. Not right on it, our house, but where we lived was right there. And so, huge body of water. Okay, so I know you as a very positive, happy, loving person. So loving Brent, right? Have you always been that way your whole life?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd like to say that I think in my heart, even like as a child, I was always fairly easygoing, let's say. Mm-hmm. We need to get my dad and my mom on here, I guess, to really to get the honest opinion, right?
They're next.
But I'd say I was fairly, don't ask my siblings, but I was fairly easygoing. And I always did want to have fun, which I'm sure, we'll talk about, in terms of process. So I'm an Enneagram type 7. Mm. You're not supposed to diagnose kids or you're not supposed to put a kid in a box in terms of their personality types and all that. But it wasn't for me. I really came out of my shell at age 16, 17. And it was because of a cousin of mine who was like a brother to me. And he basically painted the path, paved the path for me to understand what does it mean just to be yourself and to not to let some of the shackles free, right? And so I felt, for lack of a better term, more unleashed just to be myself because I didn't know what that looked like. Not to unpack too much, but with my, an overt part of my story is my parents went through an ugly divorce when I was 13. And that was super powerful, impactful for not just myself, but the whole family, of course, and my siblings. And we all worked through it differently. I think for me, I stuffed my feelings for years and years and years and years. And so I didn't even I'm the oldest, and it was, okay, I've got the responsibility gene, right? And so being the oldest, I'm just going to do what I need to do, keep plodding along and put on a stiff upper lip, right? And then live to see tomorrow. And so I think, I think I've always been wired this way, but I didn't feel the freedom to really live out, seeking the joy in life until it was later on in kind of high school and then really going into college. And really I attribute that to, the work that God's done in my heart of just knowing that I'm accepted by Him and by being loved and accepted. And the hard work is already done in terms of earning acceptance and love. And so now I get to live out of the freedom of what that means. And so this is a long-winded answer. Sorry.
Well, I have some follow-up questions when you're ready.
You bet. So cut me off now.
So parents divorced when you were 13. Huge impact. Positive, for negative or positive, it doesn't really matter, right? It just impacted. And then you said it was your older cousin when you were 16 years old? Yeah.
And so they'd come, I'd go to their house. They lived in Spokane during the season, and they had moved. They were also in professional ministry, both my uncle and my aunt. And I have a number of cousins, but my two guy cousins, they were like brothers to me. One older by 6 months and one younger by 18 months. And
is this on your mom or dad's side of the family?
This is my dad's side of the family.
Dad's side.
Yeah. And we were just thick as thieves. I mean, we would just shenanigans, and I'm one of 5 kids. I have four sisters, 2 with mom and dad, 2 with mom and stepdad.
Okay.
And so I was influenced by a lot of really strong females, grandmothers, aunts, 2 moms, and then I had a lot of sisters. So I relished in an opportunity to get to hang out with my brothers, so to speak. So yeah, it was pretty impactful.
And okay, so how many kids do you have right now? Like
I have
guys,
3 kids.
and boys, girls?
So we go boy, girl, girl. My oldest, he just turned 15.
Okay.
Middle daughter just turned 13, so she's a teenager, although she's been acting like it for about 3 years already. And then our youngest is about to be 9 in another week and a half.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So at least you have.
And my mom reminded me back at this wedding that we saw everybody at. She's like, "Oh, have you probably noticed the similarities between you and your sisters with your 3 kids?" I was like, "Yeah, but I don't want to repeat that." So
That's funny.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to get into this because you did kind of say not to get into specifics, but I'm really curious if you're willing to share what happened when you were 16. Like, what are some of the things that your cousin did? Was it just being thick as thieves, as you said, and doing stuff together, or was there like some extremely transformational moments that happened?
I think the short answer would be I saw somebody living out of their, I feel like this whole word, like be your true authentic self, right? Is over. I don't know what that means necessarily, but we do know what authenticity means, right? I felt as though, so growing up, I had this kind of descriptor of the golden child or being the oldest. I felt like I was burdened by the have tos. You ought to do. Andrew, a guy that we've done coaching with, and mutual friend of ours, he teases me, makes fun of me, rightfully so, because I use words like, well, I ought to be doing, but he's like, what did you say? So I grew up in this family where our faith and religion and religious practices were important. And I always had this strong, overt sense that there's a certain way that you live life and there's a certain way that you don't live life. And I'm not saying like I decided to not live the way that I ought to, but I felt like I was probably living for what other people thought needed to be my life and decisions that I make versus me really thinking like, what do I want? And what is God calling me to? And who am I? And so really, I think some of those emotions got stuffed through the divorce, and it's like, okay, I gotta, again, that stiff upper lip. I saw from others, okay, what does life look like when you're just being yourself? And I can be myself too. I don't need to put on this facade that I'm just doing all the things, following the to-do list. And so that was freeing. And I know that's kind of a fuzzy, squishy answer.
Can I do my best to try to summarize what you said?
Yeah.
So it was like the freedom happened, like you just became free because you could just be yourself. You learned that was how you could be, and that was okay. That was perfectly acceptable.
Yeah. And what it probably was too, Richard, is that I had in family blood, right? That, there was probably less of this concern of I've got to put on a good facade or I might lose these friends, versus I just get to be me, be a goofball, make mistakes. And these are my cousins, my brothers, right? They're still going to love me tomorrow. And so there wasn't this extra layer of, I need to over strategize or contemplate like how this is going to play out.
That's really interesting because it sounds like there was that extra layer you just described as a high level of acceptance, like being accepted.
Yep.
I don't know where I wrote. Here it is. Okay. I wrote in a coaching session with a client within the last few weeks. I came up with this thing that all of us want. I call it the AAA. We want to be acknowledged, we want to be accepted, and we want to be appreciated. And if we can have those things, then it creates an environment where something like what you had, where you're transformed into just being authentically you can happen.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
human need to be connected is so strong, so
Yeah.
strong that we're willing to not be ourselves or try to not be
Yep.
ourselves to please somebody else to accept us, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And and so, I mean, logic would say that if you felt accepted enough to be yourself at 16, then before that you didn't, due to certain
Correct.
circumstances.
Yeah. And just, yeah, I think it'd help paint the picture if I did explain a little bit more of that context. So age 13, put in front of a court magistrate and forced to make a decision on, basically ask this question: who do you love more, your mom or your dad?
Because
the
that's
court magistrate
at 13, that's what you will hear. What doesn't matter what they say, that's how you interpret it.
Correct. Yeah. And I'd like to think that it wasn't too far off in terms of what the actual words were, not saying who do you like spending time with more, let's say, right? Or what they were trying to unpack is how do we approach this whole custody plan? And so, but what I heard and pretty clearly was, who do you love more? And I wasn't going to pick my sisters, because in just the way that things came to be, they blamed my mom, not necessarily wrong, but they blamed my mom. So they decided to go live with my dad. I felt I couldn't do that to my mom to also side with my dad. And so I was FU mentality to the court magistrate and pretty much everyone around me. I started to harbor a lot of anger, and that anger and stuffing feelings like I described, right? And so I made a decision. I'm not going to pick sides. And on top of that, aside from the court magistrate and all this process, I went to my parents and I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back and forth every Sunday from mom's house to dad's house. Sunday night, 6 p.m. There's some legalism going on in my brain, right? And again, here's the way you do things and the way you don't do things. There's no process, to use that word, right? There's no process given to me. And so I had to come up with my own process. What is this, the way that I'm going to reconcile my life that I'm thrust into, which I've got to pick between mom and dad? Well, I'm not going to pick. And so out of that lack of decision, I have to come up with my own process. And my process was, I'm going to go back and forth between mom and dad's for every Sunday night at 6 p.m. The unintended consequence is I lived out of a duffel bag for 6 years until I had a nervous breakdown. Or I'd say this side of a nervous breakdown, senior year of high school, where I couldn't do it anymore. I was just done. I was stuffing feelings, right? I was trying to put on the good face and do all the things the right way, be the person other people wanted me to be, or at least what I thought in my mind I had expectations of what I needed to be. And I finally was like, no, I can't do this anymore. I got to make a decision for me. And so I approached my dad and I said, hey, not this succinctly. I said, I love you, but I can't keep going back and forth. And so I'm going to choose to live with mom. And so that's what I did the last 6 months of my high school experience. And it was super hard, telling one parent, like, I'm going to go live with the other parent, right? And it wasn't necessarily a solution that gave me a lot of peace, but it was just something that gave me some reprieve from the mental and emotional anguish of just this constant cycle of Groundhog Day.
So even though at 16 you felt free around your cousins and stuff like that, and had probably some spiritual experiences around that time as well. And I don't know, but just reading between the lines, there was still that kind of overwhelming feeling until you made that decision to just live with one of your parents, and then that gave you a little bit of stability.
A little bit of stability. And again, so unfortunately, when my parents got divorced, this is 1994, in a Christian faith context, particularly at least at our church, it's still in 1994 wasn't super common, much less common than it is today, right? To come from a split home, right? And so when your church family should be stepping up and investing and leaning more in, they pulled back. Right? Because they pulled back, and not out of lack of love necessarily, right? Trying to think through, in doing a lot of processing on this. I'm sure it wasn't that they didn't want to lean in. It's they didn't know how to. They were ill-equipped. So how do we lean into a family who's struggling and they just really need people to
Yeah.
love on them and to let them know that they're loved despite everything, the crap that's going on around them. But that didn't happen. And so people step back, and in the void, right, what happens is we fill that with other things, maybe lies, right? And two, just a lack of relationship.
Well,
And so
it's
right when we
really,
needed,
I find it super interesting. Sorry, hold that thought.
yeah,
You don't
you,
want to lose it, but
yeah,
that it's really interesting that we put the onus on the community to know what we need,
yeah.
right? And I wonder how often we do that in life, where we just
Oh, I'm sure I do it
like
all the,
almost
I
every
do it
time.
personally
It's
all the
like
time.
it's like me saying to you, Brent, "Hey, read my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Tell do for me what I need." But I don't even
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it's interesting. Anyways, keep going.
yeah. And so right when we needed community the most, right? Because adversity
Mm-hmm.
hits, um, and, brothers are built for adversity, as scripture tells us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're facing adversity and our brethren are stepping back, our family, and again, this is on us, right? We also stopped engaging more because people are pulling them away from us. So right when you would argue that, okay, you need to be in community more than ever, we're retreating from community and they're retreating from us. And so during this really difficult season of my life, I was less in our faith community, our church home, less with those brothers and sisters, right? And so I think spending time with my cousins, it was an opportunity to be in community to see like what does healthy family operating look like. There's still, my uncle was a pastor of an Assemblies of God church um, here in Washington, and then they were preparing to be ministers overseas, so they're in missionary training. And so we get to be in a really rich, faith-filled home, and to see like, hey, like when you don't have those other cares, how do you how can you be a teenager, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's go be dumb, even if it means, you know, cruising down the strip in, Spokane in a car, uh, yelling at other kids, just being kids, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. And the freedom that felt for you. That's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting. I find this, like your story it's so it highlights the needs that we have as humans, and every human, not whatever label we want to give, right? Whatever part we're at, but every human has
Yeah.
those same needs to
Yeah.
eventually feel free again. And some of us, we wear those shackles a little tighter, and
Mm-hmm.
um, and it takes a little bit longer, and somebody with a lot of compassion to kind of break them down and break it in.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad and grateful that that you had that space to go through that for yourself at that time
Mm-hmm.
with those cousins.
Yeah.
So how did you get, like, so you had that space? You give us a bit of an overview at the start. You're married now,
Mm-hmm.
and how did you get to where you are today, and to this a glowing example of positivity and just a really genuinely happy person?
Uh, you know, I've had a lot of really good modeling around me in terms of, okay, what does gratitude look like? My dad is one of the most generous, grateful, helpful humans on this planet. I kid you not. Particularly so, when you grow up like I did in a community I'm third generation here in the Tacoma area. And so when you go out into the workplace, it's hard not to meet somebody who goes, "Oh, well, who's Rod Tayet to you?" And I say, "Oh, that's my dad." And the next thing out of their mouth, right? And this is when I'm 22 to even to this day, they'd be like, "Oh, your dad is the nicest guy I've ever met." No, 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 really, he's the nicest man I've ever met.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they'll look at me and they'll go like, "Wait a minute, you look a lot like him too." And so I have to pause them at that point. I say, "Okay, just so you know, I'm just a less nice version of him." Okay.
well, well, and coming from I hope this is okay that I share this from a prior conversation we had. Your dad is an Enneagram Type 9, right? Which is
Yeah, and actually, and
the
Kristen corrected me
peacemaker.
because I think my stepmom is a 9. I think my dad is a 2.
Oh, a two. Oh, the helper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And I was
So
kind of,
always looking to help
yeah.
people. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
And, but yeah, he's been the picture of like generosity and helping. And then, uh, I heard this once, just a couple weeks ago that this human cycle of our reflection of our parents is we idolize them, then we demonize them, and then we humanize them, right?
yeah.
The cycle,
Yeah.
right? And now that I can humanize, like understand my dad, like I can look back and say, oh, Dad, the reason that you were 2 hours late to pick me up at soccer practice was because you were helping all these other people, right? And so that's just how he's wired. He wants to help. And if there's an opportunity, an urgent need, he's going to step into that urgent need.
Mhm.
Um, but I've also come to realize, like, acts of service. He's the first one to provide those acts of service, and that's one of the ways I feel loved too, is because my dad he'll do whatever
Serve
it
you.
takes to help.
So the question I want to ask you in a different way is, if you were to, like, looking back on your life, um, what do you think is one of the single biggest things that has enabled you to be resilient and to overcome and get to where you are today?
Unequivocally, I can tell you that it comes down to I've witnessed seeing God show up in my life. And it's usually demonstrated or evidenced in the fact of God using his people, us, in surgical ways at the right time, and in the moment of maybe greatest needs, right? And also, quick backstory to back that up, right? Is I would have been a messed up human if I would have stayed in that state I described I was in at even 16, right? Yeah, and I get to see how like I could live more freed up, but that doesn't really give you liberty, right? Just to see how someone else is living free, you've got to be free. And my moment of freedom, my start of my new journey of freedom, came after living for myself after high school, partying, just pursuing life, filling life with dating, partying, that kind of thing, right? And by God's grace, it was short-lived. But so fall after high school graduation, after a summer of, I went into a tailspin. We could fill a whole another podcast with all the crap of life that hit me that summer, but I got to a real low place. And it was at the bottom of that low place. A friend of mine from high school died in a freak drowning accident. She was a year older than me, and I go to her memorial service that was in our community, or just, everybody at my school. I went to a small private school in a small little town, and we commuted from all over the place. So anyways, in this other town, and it was super moving to me to be at this memorial service where you have 300-400 people who are standing up to proclaim and testify of how their life was changed by this teenage girl, right? Who had led dozens of people to Christ, who had just given her life in such a beautiful manner, right, for others. And I was weeping in this memorial service, and selfishly had nothing to do with her, and it had everything to do with I was looking at my own life and surveying how I was living my life for my own freedoms, because I was trying to chase that, right, and realizing how dark and endless, pointless that end is. And it was out of that I felt God's tugging on my heart that I want to live for you, Jesus. I don't want to live for my own life, because living for me sucks. It looks like what this last 3 months look like. And I'm eating the meal that I've created of that last 3 months. And so it was in that tugging in my heart, and God smacking me, basically like, what are you doing? And me going, God, Jesus, I want to live for you. And realizing, okay, what that probably needs to look like is to be in a community of other men who love Jesus, other brothers, right? And I got a glimpse of that with my cousins, like I described, right? And so I went and I applied to 2 different universities, I was going to community college at the time, and it was not a good place for me. I needed community, even though it's community college, right? It lacked the community part. And so I applied to two different universities, visited both campuses, and after visiting Seattle Pacific University, I literally, for the first time in my life, I believe, I felt God's presence when I was walking the campus with my dad. And my prayer before this was, God, I can't make a decision between this or anything, but I'm going to submit both applications and just, you do the work. Like whatever happens, happens. And I get back from touring that campus. And it was actually, I think, the second tour. But I felt God's presence on that campus in such an overt way that I knew, it's like, okay, I submitted just the one application. But get this, this is like late November, early December, trying to get in for a January term. They lost my application twice. Submitted the application the third time, and they processed it and got me, they reviewed it, and I was approved and in the system within like 3 weeks, which was unheard of. I then get placed on the smallest of all dorm floors of the campus, 18 men. And I was one of these 18. Excuse me, it was only 15, I believe. So I was one of 15, and a guy was transferring out, and I was replacing him. I didn't know a soul at SPU, but I show up, and within the end of the first week, I had 14 other brothers who embraced me truly like a brother. 5 of those dudes I go on a ski trip with every January, February, and those 5 dudes were in my wedding, and I was in each of their weddings. And so it was this like, smack across the face, like I was describing, of me getting my life on track, living in community, and really like surrendering my heart to Jesus. And then he showing up and pulling the puzzle pieces of people in my life to this day, right? Of where God is putting the right people in my life at the right time. And he's doing that for all of us when we submit to him. So I guess to answer your question, it would be submitting to God and what he wants for me, not desiring and chasing what I want.
So beautiful. We're going to have to end it there. We might have to do this again.
Let's do it. One, I feel selfish because you asked me all the questions, but I've got questions for you.
Well, we can do that another time. Not selfish at all. Thank you so much, Brent. It's been a real pleasure to have you on. And if somebody wanted to reach out or get in touch with you,
I'd say I'm terrible at social media, but I'd say I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. Some of the work that I'm doing also with a podcast called The Giving Experience. You can probably see like we're just sharing more and more other people's stories too, around how we see God showing up in miraculous ways. But I'd say probably the easiest is just reach out to me on Facebook or Instagram. If you put in Tayet, there's a short list of people in there. And I'm one of them. Tayet. As opposed to
Tayet.
first name Brent, last name Tayet, as opposed to a lot of people think it's the French Lafayette. No, it's Norwegian. Thick-skulled, square-headed, blockhead Norwegian.